Welcome, dear students. Today we are going to start chapter 10 of History, End of Colonialism and the Cold War. This is part 1, and in this part, we are going to discuss international political scenario after the Second World War, nationalist movements in the colonies, and decolonization with some examples of the countries like India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Let's begin with the introduction. You know that the colonial regime in India and Pakistan came to an end in August 1947, and these two countries became independent nation states. Within 30 years of the end of the Second World War, from 1945 to 1975, all the countries of Asia and Africa threw off the colonial yoke and became independent nations. Indonesia gained freedom in 1945, India and Pakistan in 1947, Burma, Myanmar, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka in 1948, and several other countries thereafter. The world map was thus transformed between 1940 and 1980. The process that ended colonial rule and led to the establishment of independent governments in different countries is called decolonization. You can clearly see the map that there are countries which are shaded in green, yellow, and purple color. So that you can understand the countries which are highlighted in yellow got independence before 1960, and the countries which are highlighted in green got independence between 1960 to 1970, and the purple highlighted countries gained independence in 1970. The process of colonization had many different aspects. First, political power in the colonies lay in the hands of the imperialist powers such as Britain. Second, the colonies were economically exploited. Raw materials were procured cheaply from them, processed in European factories, and the finished goods were sold in the international markets. Also, the colonies were heavily taxed to generate revenue for the colonial governments. Third, the people in the colonies were indoctrinated to see themselves as uncivilized, with the European nations being the messengers of the civilization. They were made to believe that their well being lay in internalizing and accepting European culture and thinking. Britain, France, Holland, Portugal, and Japan were the dominant imperialist countries that established their colonies in America, Asia, and Africa. International political scenario after the Second World War. The old imperialist European countries were economically crippled by the cost of fighting the Second World War. France, Holland, Britain, as well as Japan were disrupted by the war, and these countries had to seek the support of the United States of America (USA) to rebuild their shattered economies. The Second World War was a global battle that defended freedom and democracy, with Britain and the Allied powers opposing Germany and the Axis power. But the problem they now faced was to ensure unity and stability in the colonies during the transition of power. The imperialist countries also wanted to ensure that the colonies adopted economic and political policies that protected their own interests. In those days, the countries of the world were divided into two power blocks. One bloc comprised the USSR and its allied countries, and the other bloc comprised the USA and its allied countries. USSR wanted to strengthen its bloc by helping the colonies win their independence. America did not take a backseat to Russia in this competition to win the allegiance of newly independent countries. It wanted the colonies to win their freedom before the USSR backed parties become powerful and seized power. This global competition between USA and USSR had a marked impact on the decolonization process. Both countries were keen to end the colonial system and see the colonies gain their independence. This rivalry laid the ground for the emergence of new kind of colonialism. Both Russia and America extended large loans to the newly independent countries to win their allegiance and make them indebted. To sum up, it can be said that the end of the Second World War created a situation in which the imperialist countries were left with little choice but to grant independence to their colonies. But at the same time, these newly independent countries found themselves caught up in the competition between the two superpowers, becoming under their sway in some way or the other. Next topic, nationalist movements in the colonies. The credit for closing the chapter on colonialism must surely go to the people's movements in the colonies that won them freedom between 1945 and 1975. Apart from these armed rebellions, peasants, workers, traders, and the educated middle class launched movements to seek their demands. The national freedom movements in the colonies also began to gather momentum. In India, the nationalist movement can be traced back to 1985. China, too, had a nationalist movement that began in 1911 and culminated in communist revolution in 1949. The national movements in the colonies faced many challenges. To begin with, the people in most of the colonies were divided into small communities on the basis of tribe, caste, language, region, and religion. The second challenge was that the prominent nationalist leaders in the colonies were mostly educated in the modern liberal tradition, as a result of which they were influenced by democratic, liberal, or communist ideologies. A third challenge was that the educated nationalist leaders mostly belonged to the wealthy and elite classes, which made it difficult for them to easily identify with or influence the masses of people who belong. Another challenge facing the nationalist leader was that most countries did not have a democratic tradition, so it was not easy task to build up a nationalist movement based on people's participation. India was an exception in this respect. The country had been exposed to democratic practices since 1880 when the British ruler introduced public franchise, though in a limited way, allowing people to elect their representatives to the municipalities. Between 1990 and 1935, popular election was extended to choosing representatives to the provincial assemblies. In addition, primary education had a wider reach in Indian population than in other countries, with many colleges and universities for higher education also being established. This education system helped the emergence of an aware middle class that could represent the interest of all classes, castes, religions, and regions in the country. On the political front, too, there was a democratic organization, the Congress Party, that could lead the national movement. In addition, there were other political parties in the country to represent different ideologies and fight for the rights of different communities, classes, and regions. For these reasons, the democratic system was fairly firmly established in India. This was not the case in most other countries, which lacked such democratic institutions and experiences, the only other exception being Sri Lanka. That is why many of these countries saw their freedom struggles replacing colonial rule with dictatorships or military rule. Now, let's move on to the next topic, decolonization. Let's study about India. The movement against British rule in India gained momentum after 1935. Peasants, workers, Adivasis, youth, etc. in all regions of the country were by then opposing the colonial establishment. The Congress Party claimed that it represented the interest of the entire nation, so it would be able to deal with conflicting interests objectively without taking sides. The national movement was becoming more intense during this phase, with peasants' revolts underway in some states and industrial workers in cities organizing strikes and demonstrations. The story of how independent India drafted its democratic constitution and how universal adult suffrage was established to enable the people to elect their representatives to the legislative wings of the new government. Indonesia. Indonesia is a country of islands situated to the southeast of India. You learnt in class 9 how the country became a colony of Holland, the Netherlands. Here we shall learn about Indonesia's story of independence. Nationalist activities thus flourished during the period of political instability from 1939 to 1945. You can see in this picture Sukarno announcing Indonesia's independence in 1945. Sukarno declared Indonesia an independent country on August 17, 1945, with Japan's consent once it became evident that the Japanese faced defeat in the war. On December 27, 1949, power was officially transferred to Indonesia, bringing an end to Dutch colonial rule. India consistently supported the freedom movement in Indonesia and supported it in the UNO. It hosted in Bandung an important conference of 29 newly independent countries of Asia and Africa participated. The conference opposed all forms of colonialism and established certain principles for establishing peace and friendship among the countries. Indonesia tried to establish a parliamentary democracy. The first general election was held in 1955 with several parties winning support in their respective regions. The communists put pressure on the government to take over the nationalize the Dutch and British companies in the country. A land reform law was also enacted under which land was distributed to the poor peasants. Hmm. Students, you can see the picture. These were the leaders of freedom struggles in Africa, Asia, and East Europe at the Bandung Conference in April 1955. From our country, he was Nehru. Queen Nkrumah from Ghana, Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt, Sukarno from Indonesia, and Marshal Tito from Yugoslavia. So these were the leaders who participated in the conference. America became apprehensive that the communist influence would drive Indonesia into the Russian bloc. Sukarno declared President's rule with the backing of the communist parties, thus putting an end to parliamentary democracy. Sukarno declared President's rule with the backing of the communist parties, thus putting an end to the parliamentary democracy. To prevent this, a faction of the Indonesia army launched a mass campaign to eradicate communism, as did the Islamic fundamentalists. Communist cadres were slaughtered on the mass scale, some estimates placing the death toll at 5 lakh. Sukarno was ousted and the army installed Suharto as president of Indonesia, with America backing the transfer of power. Suharto's government ruled until 1998, after which democracy was once again established in Indonesia. Thank you for watching.